Montana Territory, 1872. The shadow of the Civil War still stretched long across America's heartland, but out here, beneath Montana's vast sky, a different kind of battle raged, the struggle of man against wilderness, against solitude, against the unforgiving nature of frontier life. Here, Jacob Lawson had convinced himself that a man needed nothing but his horse, his rifle, and enough grit to face each dawn. Love was a luxury for those who'd never watched winter snows claim entire herds, or witnessed how quick the frontier could turn a promising life to dust. At 26, Jacob had already lived several lifetimes' worth of frontier hardship. His ranch, modest but growing, stood as testament to his stubborn refusal to be beaten by this land that both punished and provided. He'd built the Crescent Ridge Ranch from nothing but calloused hands and obstinate will, each fence post a declaration that he meant to stay when others had fled. But tonight, as spring rains hammered his cabin roof, he sat alone at his rough-hewn table, staring at a letter that threatened to upend the careful isolation he'd constructed. Arriving Helena, May 15th. Yours, Rose Henderson. 6 words from a woman he'd never met, yet had legally bound himself to through an exchange of letters, and a marriage certificate filed with a county clerk 300 miles east. Jacob ran his hand through his wheat-colored hair, his blue eyes focused on nothing. What kind of fool marries a stranger? The kind who realizes too late that a ranch needs more than one pair of hands to survive, he answered himself. The truth he wouldn't admit aloud was simpler. The kind of fool who finally recognized the echoing emptiness of his cabin for what it was, a reflection of the hollowness growing inside him. But Jacob had convinced himself this arrangement was purely practical. Romance had no place on the frontier. Marriage was a business agreement, nothing more. People who opened their hearts in this unforgiving country only gave the wilderness one more way to destroy them. Jacob folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket. May 15th, 3 days from now, he'd have a wife. The thought settled like a stone in his stomach. Not for the first time, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. Helena, Montana Territory bustled with the nervous energy of a young settlement determined to prove itself more than just another mining camp. The stagecoach kicked up dust as it thundered down the main street, carrying Rose Henderson toward her future, a future she'd crafted from desperation, hope, and the advertisement of a Montana rancher seeking a bride. At 20 years old, Rose had already weathered the loss of her entire family to influenza. Their small Iowa farm, once alive with her parents' laughter and her younger brother's antics, had become an unbearable reminder of everything she'd lost. Selling the land had given her enough money to survive, but not enough to build a new life. When she'd seen Jacob Lawson's advertisement in the newspaper, "Rancher Seeks Bride," must be hardy, hardworking, and of good character, she'd recognized it for what it was, not romance but possibility. The coach lurched to a stop, and Rose smoothed her cornflower blue traveling dress, a hand moving instinctively to check that her honey-blonde hair remained properly pinned beneath her bonnet. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the driver opened the door. This moment, stepping from this coach, would mark the division between her old life and whatever waited beyond. Helena Station, folks. End of the line. Rose emerged from the stagecoach, blinking in the bright May sunshine. Her eyes searched the small gathering, looking for the man who matched the brief description from their correspondence, tall, fair-haired, blue-eyed. She'd imagined him 1,000 different ways, yet none of her imaginings had prepared her for the reality of Jacob Lawson. He stood apart from the crowd, leaning against a hitching post, his hat pulled low over his eyes. Even at a distance, she could see the tension in his stance, a man uncomfortable with waiting, with town, with the very errand that had brought him here. When he spotted her, he straightened, and Rose felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the unexpected youth in his face, the unexpected grace in his movements as he approached. "Miss Henderson," his voice was deeper than she'd expected, rough-edged like he didn't use it often. "Mr. Lawson." She extended her gloved hand, determined to appear composed even as her heart raced. "I recognize you from your description." Wasn't much of a description. He took her hand briefly, awkwardly, then gestured toward her luggage. "Just these 2 bags." "Everything I couldn't bear to part with," she answered simply. Jacob nodded, lifting her trunks as if they weighed nothing. "Wagons this way. It's a 4-hour ride to the ranch. We should start if we want to make it before dark." As they walked, Rose felt the stares of townspeople, some curious, some pitying. Mail-order brides weren't uncommon in the territories, but that didn't make their situation any less strange. She tied her future to a man she knew only through a handful of carefully worded letters. A man who now walked beside her, close enough to touch yet separated by a gulf of uncertainty. "Is it very isolated?" she asked as he loaded her trunks into the wagon. "Your ranch." Something flickered across his face, perhaps surprise at her directness. "Yes, nearest neighbors 5 miles, town's a half-day ride in good weather." He paused, studying her as if reassessing. "It's not an easy life." "I didn't expect it would be," Rose replied. "I didn't come west for ease, Mr. Lawson." "Jacob," he said after a moment, "seems we should at least use given names, considering." "Considering we're to be married tomorrow," Rose finished silently. The weight of that reality settled over her as she allowed him to help her onto the wagon seat. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Jacob Lawson, wife to a stranger, mistress of a ranch she'd never seen. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a curious lightness, the certainty of movement forward after months of stagnation. As the wagon pulled away from Helena, Rose stole glances at her future husband's profile. The strong jaw, the straight nose, the way his fair hair curled slightly where it emerged beneath his hat. He was handsome in a weathered way, younger than she'd expected, perhaps only 5 or 6 years her senior, but it was the sadness etched around his eyes that caught her attention most. Here was a man who had known loss just as she had. "You're younger than I expected," Jacob said suddenly, breaking a silence that had stretched for miles. "Does that disappoint you?" Rose asked, her voice calm despite her racing heart. He shook his head. "No, just surprised. Your letters were mature." "I've had to grow up quickly," she replied, watching the landscape open before them, endless rolling hills dotted with ponderosa pines, the distant mountains capped with snow even in May. "That makes 2 of us," he said, and then fell silent again, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Rose turned her face to the vast Montana sky, feeling the spring wind against her cheeks. She had come west seeking stability, security, purpose, not love. Love, she had convinced herself, was a luxury she could no longer afford after watching it be stripped away. Better to build a life on practical foundations than risk having her heart broken again. Yet sitting beside this taciturn stranger with the sad eyes, watching the wilderness unfold before them, Rose felt something she hadn't expected, a whisper of possibility, of hope. Perhaps this arrangement would prove to be more than mere survival for both of them. But as the wagon rattled on toward Crescent Ridge Ranch, neither Rose nor Jacob could have anticipated the challenges that awaited them, nor how quickly their carefully constructed barriers would begin to crumble in the face of frontier life's harsh demands. They arrived at Crescent Ridge as the sun dipped below the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Rose's first glimpse of her new home came as they crested a hill, a modest log cabin nestled against a backdrop of pines, a small barn, corrals, and beyond them, grasslands stretching toward distant mountains. "It's not much," Jacob said, misinterpreting her silence for disappointment. "I've been adding to it each year." "It's beautiful," Rose replied honestly. After months in boarding houses and stagecoaches, the sight of the ranch, solid, real, anchored to the earth, filled her with unexpected emotion. "You built all this yourself?" Pride flickered briefly across Jacob's face. Most of it had help with the barn raising. He hesitated, then added, "I started working on another room, for you." "It's not finished yet." The admission touched her. He'd prepared for her arrival, considered her comfort. It was a small thing, perhaps, but significant. "Thank you, I'm sure it will be fine." As they drew closer, a border collie came bounding across the yard, barking joyously. "That's Scout," Jacob said, the first real warmth entering his voice. "Best cattle dog in the territory." When the wagon stopped, Jacob jumped down and came around to help her descend. His hands were strong and calloused against hers, and for a moment they stood face to face, close enough that Rose could see the golden flecks in his blue eyes, could smell leather and pine and horse on his clothes. "Welcome to Crescent Ridge," he said quietly and released her hands. The evening passed in a blur of practical arrangements. Jacob showed her the cabin, a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, his bedroom, and the half-finished addition that would be hers. The furnishings were simple but solid, everything built for function rather than beauty. Yet there were surprising touches, bookshelves filled with volumes, a rocking chair by the fire, curtains on the windows. "The shelves need filling," Jacob commented, noticing her interest in the books. "Haven't had much chance to get to town for new ones." "I brought several," Rose admitted. "Books were the hardest things to leave behind." Something like approval flickered in his eyes. Winter nights are long here, good to have something to fill them. They ate a simple supper of beans and cornbread, the silence between them broken only by Scout's occasional whines for scraps. Rose studied Jacob covertly across the table, trying to reconcile this quiet, competent man with the husband he would become tomorrow. There was gentleness in his hands despite their strength, thoughtfulness in his sparse words. But he held himself apart as if afraid to occupy too much space in his own home. "The preacher comes through once a month," Jacob said finally, addressing the elephant in the room. "He'll be at the Henderson place tomorrow noon. I told him we'd meet him there for the ceremony, unless you've changed your mind." Rose met his gaze directly. "Have you?" Jacob studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "No," he said finally. "A man should honor his commitments." Not exactly a romantic declaration, Rose thought, but she appreciated his honesty. "Then neither have I. We made an agreement, and I intend to keep it." He nodded, seeming relieved. "We should leave by mid-morning. It's not far, but the creek might be high with the spring melt." Later, as Rose settled into her temporary bed, a pallet in the unfinished room, separated by a hanging blanket for privacy, she found herself listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Montana night. The distant howl of coyotes, the soft nickering of horses in the corral, the creak of the cabin settling. And closer, the sound of Jacob moving quietly through the main room, banking the fire for the night. Tomorrow she would become his wife. The thought should have terrified her, yet instead she felt strangely calm. Jacob Lawson wasn't what she had expected, but perhaps that was for the best. He seemed honest, hardworking, decent, qualities more valuable than charm or romantic words. They could build something here, even if it wasn't the love match of storybooks. As sleep began to claim her, Rose realized she'd made one crucial miscalculation. She had come west believing her heart safely locked away, protected from further loss. But something about this place, about the quiet rancher with the sad eyes, had already begun to chip away at her carefully constructed walls. If she wasn't careful, Rose Henderson might find herself risking her heart after all. The wedding was as simple as the lives they expected to lead together, a brief ceremony at the neighboring Henderson ranch, witnessed by the middle-aged couple who owned it and their 3 children. Rose wore her best dress, a pale blue muslin that brought out the color of her eyes. Jacob had cleaned up impressively, his usually wind-blown hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved to reveal a strong jawline and unexpectedly full lips. As they stood before the traveling preacher, speaking vows neither had written nor fully comprehended the weight of, Rose felt a curious sense of displacement, as if watching herself from outside her body. The words flowed over her: to love, honor, cherish, until death do us part. Such solemn promises to make to a virtual stranger. When Jacob slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, another surprise that he'd thought to procure a ring, the cool metal seemed to anchor her back to reality. This was happening. She was becoming Rose Lawson, leaving behind the last tangible connection to her family. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher declared. "You may kiss your bride." For a moment Jacob looked panicked, as if this part of the ceremony had escaped his planning. Then he leaned forward and pressed his lips gently, briefly against hers. A kiss as tentative as their relationship, over almost before it began, yet Rose felt it like a brand against her mouth. The small celebration afterward was awkward but well-intentioned. Mrs. Henderson had prepared a wedding dinner, and her husband broke out a bottle of whiskey for toasts. Their children peppered Rose with questions about Iowa, about her journey west, about whether she'd brought them any candy from town. Normal domestic chaos that made the unnatural situation feel briefly ordinary. Through it all, Jacob remained mostly silent, polite but watchful, like a man waiting for something to go wrong. When he did speak, answering Mr. Henderson's questions about spring calving or the condition of the north pasture, his knowledge and competence were evident. Here was a man who understood his land, who knew every creek and ridge of his property, who could read weather in a distant cloud formation. Rose found herself wondering what it would be like when he came to know her with the same attention to detail. They left as afternoon shadows lengthened, the Hendersons waving them off with good-natured advice and invitations to Sunday dinners. The ride back to Crescent Ridge was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. Something had shifted between them. A legal bond now connected them, yes, but also a shared experience, their first as a unit rather than as individuals. "They seem like good neighbors," Rose said as the wagon crested the hill that would bring their ranch into view. Jacob nodded. The Hendersons have been here longer than most, helped me when I first arrived. He glanced at her. Martha, Mrs. Henderson, she'll be glad to have another woman nearby. Not many women out here willing to face frontier life. Yet here I am, Rose said with a small smile. Here you are, he agreed, and something in his tone made her cheeks warm. As they approached the cabin, their home, Rose noticed Jacob growing tense again. When they stopped, he sat for a moment, hands tight on the reins, before turning to her. I know this isn't how most marriages begin, he said awkwardly. I want you to know I don't expect, he stopped, clearly struggling with his words. The room isn't finished yet, and even when it is, I won't presume. That is, I understand this is an arrangement of convenience for both of us. Rose felt a complicated mixture of relief and something like disappointment. I appreciate that, Jacob. Perhaps we could view this as a partnership first. The rest can develop as it may. He nodded, visible relief softening his features. A partnership, yes. That seems sensible. When he helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Rose looked up to find him studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. I want you to be happy here, he said simply, or at least content. The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her. I believe I could be, she answered honestly. In time. That evening, their first as husband and wife, passed in domestic simplicity. They prepared supper together, Rose taking over the kitchen while Jacob tended to evening chores. They ate at the table he had built, sitting across from each other as the light faded outside. Afterward, Jacob showed her a trunk of his mother's things he had stored away, linens, curtains, a few pieces of china that had somehow survived the journey west. You should use whatever you like, he told her. Make the place your own. Later, as they sat before the fire, Jacob surprised her by pulling out a well-worn copy of the Iliad and offering to read aloud. His voice, rough at first, smoothed as he lost himself in the ancient story of war and honor. Rose watched his face in the firelight, seeing new aspects of this man she had married, intelligence, sensitivity, a quiet passion that his taciturn exterior concealed. When it came time to retire, Jacob showed her to the room they had prepared earlier, his room, with the larger bed and chest of drawers. I'll take the pallet in the new room, he said firmly when she protested. It's no hardship. I've slept on worse. Alone in his bed, surrounded by the scent of him on the pillows, pine and leather and clean male skin, Rose stared into the darkness, wondering at the strange turns her life had taken. She had come west expecting to make a practical arrangement with a grizzled, older rancher. Instead, she found herself married to a man whose complexities were only beginning to reveal themselves. Outside, an owl called into the night. From the unfinished room, she heard Jacob shift on his pallet, the boards creaking beneath him. Both together and apart, husband and wife in name but strangers in truth. Yet something had begun between them, something fragile but promising, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through Montana soil. The days that followed established a rhythm to their shared life. Rose took over management of the cabin, transforming it with small touches, wildflowers in tin cans on the table, her books mingling with his on the shelves, curtains from the trunk brightening windows that had known only utilitarian coverings. Jacob watched these changes with a mixture of surprise and approval, as if seeing his home through new eyes. For his part, Jacob introduced Rose to ranch life with patience and care. He showed her the vegetative garden that needed tending, the chicken coop that provided eggs and occasional meat, the spring house where milk and butter were kept cool. He taught her how to recognize the different sounds that might mean trouble, the particular bark Scout gave for predators, the restless movements of cattle that could signal storms approaching. They worked side by side during daylight hours, Rose learning to manage the domestic aspects of ranch life, while Jacob tended to the cattle, fences, and endless repairs. In the evenings, they shared quiet meals and often read together before the fire. Jacob would sometimes tell her stories of his early days on the ranch, of blizzards survived and cattle drives completed. Rose, in turn, shared memories of Iowa, of her family, of the life she had left behind. Yet for all this growing companionship, a careful distance remained between them. Jacob was unfailingly respectful, almost formal at times. He never entered her room without knocking, never presumed physical familiarity beyond the occasional steadying hand on her elbow or back. If their fingers brushed while passing dishes at supper, he would withdraw as if burned. Rose found herself both appreciating his restraint and wondering if it meant he found her unappealing. The answer came unexpectedly, nearly 2 weeks after their wedding. Rose had been hanging laundry, enjoying the warm May sunshine after days of spring rain. Her hair had come partially loose from its pins, and she'd rolled up her sleeves against the heat. When she turned to fetch another sheet from the basket, she found Jacob watching her from the edge of the yard, his expression unguarded for once. The naked longing on his face stole her breath. He looked quickly away when their eyes met, busying himself with a nearby fence post that suddenly required inspection. But Rose had seen enough to understand. Jacob Lawson desired her. He was simply too honorable, too determined to give her time to act on that desire. The knowledge changed something within her. That night, as they sat before the fire, Rose found herself studying him openly. The strong hands that turned pages so carefully, the profile outlined in firelight, the way his shirt stretched across broad shoulders. When he looked up and caught her watching, she didn't look away. "Is something wrong?" he asked, closing his book. "No," she said softly. "I was just thinking that I hardly know my own husband." Jacob's expression became guarded. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," she answered simply. "How you came to Montana, why you chose this life, what you dream about." He was silent so long that Rose thought he might refuse to answer. Then, hesitantly at first but with growing confidence, Jacob began to speak. He told her of growing up in Pennsylvania, of losing his father in the war, of heading west at 19 with nothing but determination and his father's rifle. He spoke of working cattle drives and ranch jobs until he'd saved enough for a small claim, of the brutal first winter when he'd nearly given up, of the satisfaction of watching his herd grow year by year. "And yet you were alone," Rose said when he finished, "successful but solitary." Jacob stared into the fire. "I convinced myself that was enough. That connection was a luxury I couldn't afford." He glanced at her. "What about you?" What dreams brought Rose Henderson to answer a stranger's advertisement? "Safety," she admitted, "security, after losing everyone. I just wanted somewhere to belong again." She met his gaze, "and I was tired of being alone too." Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition, perhaps, of the similar wounds they both carried. Jacob reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw, and took her hand in his. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm, raising goosebumps along her arm. "I'm glad you came," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Even if I'm not much good at showing it." Rose turned her hand to lace her fingers through his. "You're better at it than you think." They sat like that, hands joined, as the fire burned low. When Jacob finally stood to bank it for the night, his movements seemed reluctant, as if breaking a spell. At the doorway to her room, he paused, looking down at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Good night, Rose," he said softly. "Good night, Jacob," she whispered back, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek before he turned away. In bed that night, Rose touched the place where his fingers had been, remembering the warmth of his skin against hers. They were making progress, she realized, slow, careful steps toward something neither had expected to find. But there was still so much unspoken between them, so much uncertainty about what kind of marriage theirs would become. Neither Rose nor Jacob could have known that their cautious courtship was about to be dramatically accelerated by circumstances beyond their control, circumstances that would test both their fledgling partnership and the walls each had built around their hearts. The rains came the following week, not the gentle spring showers they had known, but torrential downpours that turned creeks into raging rivers and paths into muddy quagmires. Jacob spent long days in the driving rain, moving cattle to higher ground, reinforcing the barn against wind, returning each evening soaked and exhausted. Rose would have hot food waiting, dry clothes, and increasingly, worry in her eyes as the storms showed no signs of abating. On the fourth day, Jacob didn't return at dusk as expected. As darkness fell, Rose paced the cabin, peering anxiously through rain-lashed windows. Scout, who had remained at the cabin rather than accompanying Jacob as usual, grew increasingly agitated, whining at the door. By midnight, with the storm reaching new levels of fury, Rose knew something was wrong. Jacob was too experienced to be caught out after dark in such weather unless something had prevented his return. When Scout began barking frantically toward the north pasture, Rose made her decision. Donning Jacob's spare oilskin coat and hat, she lit a lantern and stepped into the howling darkness, Scout bounding ahead. The rain struck like needles against her face, the wind threatening to tear the lantern from her grip. She followed Scout along the muddy track toward the creek that divided their property, the creek that had been swelling dangerously for days. When she reached the crossing, the beam of her lantern revealed why Jacob hadn't returned. The simple bridge he had built lay mostly destroyed, broken timbers jutting from churning waters. And there, on the far bank, she could just make out a figure slumped against a tree, Jacob, unmoving. "Jacob!" she screamed against the wind, but her voice was lost in the storm's fury. Scout was already splashing into the creek, fighting the current to reach his master. Rose hesitated only a moment before following, knowing the danger but unable to stand by while Jacob might be seriously injured. The water hit her like an icy blow, instantly soaking through her clothes, pulling at her legs with frightening strength. She kept her focus on the far bank, on Jacob's still form, fighting for each step against the current. Halfway across, her foot slipped on a submerged rock, and for a terrifying moment, Rose went under, the lantern extinguished as water closed over her head. The current grabbed her, tumbling her downstream before she managed to catch hold of a broken bridge support. Gasping, she pulled herself up, clinging to the timber as she regained her footing. Abandoning any hope of crossing directly, Rose worked her way downstream until she found a narrower section where fallen trees created a precarious natural bridge. Climbing across on hands and knees, she finally reached the far bank and raced to where Jacob lay. He was conscious but clearly injured, his face pale beneath streaks of mud. "Rose," he murmured in confusion as she knelt beside him. "You shouldn't be out here, it's not safe." "Neither should you," she countered, examining him quickly. His right leg was pinned beneath a fallen branch, and when she touched his shoulder, he winced. "What happened?" "Bridge gave way," he managed through gritted teeth. "Horse bolted. Think my shoulder's dislocated. Legs trapped." Working by feel in the darkness, Rose assessed the branch pinning him. Too heavy for her to lift alone, but perhaps she could lever it up enough for him to pull free. Using another branch as a makeshift pry bar, she managed to raise the fallen timber just enough. Jacob dragged himself clear, a harsh sound of pain escaping him despite his obvious effort to remain silent. "We need to get you home," Rose said, helping him to sit. "Can you walk if I support you?" Jacob nodded grimly. "No choice." The journey back to the cabin was a nightmare of mud, pain, and near falls. Jacob leaned heavily on Rose, his normally powerful frame hampered by injury and exhaustion. Several times they had to stop while he fought waves of dizziness. By the time they reached the cabin, they were both shaking with cold and fatigue. Inside, Rose helped Jacob to the chair nearest the fire, which had burned low in her absence. She quickly added wood, building it back to a blaze, then turned her attention to her injured husband. His clothes were soaked through, his face ashen with pain. "We need to get you out of these wet things," she said, practical despite her racing heart. When he nodded weakly, she began unbuttoning his shirt, careful around his injured shoulder. As she revealed his chest, lined but muscled from years of physical labor, Rose felt a flush that had nothing to do with the fire's warmth. But there was no time for such reactions. Jacob's shoulder was visibly displaced, the joint swollen and discolored. "It needs to be set," she said, meeting his eyes. "My father dislocated his shoulder once. I watched the doctor fix it." Jacob studied her face, then nodded once. "Do it." Rose positioned herself as she remembered the doctor doing, placing one hand on Jacob's shoulder, the other gripping his arm. "This will hurt," she warned. "I trust you," he said simply. The words gave her courage. With a swift, decisive movement, Rose rotated his arm and pushed the joint back into place. Jacob's whole body went rigid, a harsh sound torn from his throat before he controlled it. But when she checked the shoulder, the joint was properly aligned. "Thank you," he managed, his breathing ragged. "Not many women could have done that." "Not many would have had to," she replied, moving to examine his leg. The trouser was torn, revealing a deep gash along his calf. "This needs cleaning and bandaging." As Rose tended his injuries, heating water for compresses, cleaning the wound, binding his shoulder to immobilize it, a new intimacy developed between them. There was no room for shyness or uncertainty in the face of such immediate needs. She helped him change completely into dry clothes, averting her eyes at appropriate moments but necessarily seeing more of her husband than she had before. When she had done all she could, Rose finally attended to her own soaked condition, changing quickly behind the privacy screen. When she emerged in her nightdress and robe, Jacob was watching her from the chair where she'd settled him. "You could have been killed coming after me like that," he said quietly. "You would have done the same for me," she replied, bringing him a cup of hot coffee laced with whiskey for the pain. "That's different." "Is it?" Rose challenged. "Are my promises worth less than yours? When I said in sickness and in health, did you think I didn't mean it?" Jacob stared at her, something like wonder dawning in his expression. "I didn't think you'd had time to mean any of it yet." Rose knelt beside his chair, taking his uninjured hand in hers. "Perhaps I'm beginning to." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken emotion. Then Jacob lifted his hand to her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek with reverence. "I don't deserve you," he said softly. "You don't get to decide that," Rose whispered back. When he kissed her this time, it was nothing like the brief, formal touch of their wedding day. This was a real kiss, tender at first, then deepening as Rose responded. His hand tangled in her loose hair, hers rested against his chest where she could feel his heart racing to match her own. When they finally parted, both breathing quickly, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since I first saw you step down from that stagecoach," he admitted. "Why didn't you?" "I was afraid," he said simply. "Not of you, of what you made me feel. I've spent years convincing myself I didn't need anyone. Then you arrived and upset everything." Rose smiled, trailing her fingers along his jaw. "I'm not sorry. Neither am I, not anymore." That night Rose helped Jacob to bed, his bed which she had been using while he slept on the pallet. When she turned to leave, his hand caught hers. "Stay," he said softly, "just to sleep. I don't want to be apart from you tonight." Rose hesitated only a moment before sliding beneath the covers beside him. They lay facing each other in the darkness, not touching, except where their hands remained joined between them. It was chaste by any measure, yet the most intimate moment of Rose's life, this shared breath, this connection, this trust. "Good night, my wife," Jacob whispered. "Good night, my husband," Rose replied, and felt the words settle into place like missing pieces of a puzzle finally found. Jacob's recovery forced a new pattern to their days. With his shoulder immobilized and his leg healing, many tasks that had been his alone now fell to Rose. She rose before dawn to handle feeding, learned to milk the cow when Jacob talked her through the process, and somehow managed the endless small emergencies of ranch life with determination if not always skill. For Jacob, the enforced idleness was its own kind of torture. He supervised from the porch when he could, gave instructions, and fretted visibly when Rose took on tasks he considered too dangerous or difficult. Their first real argument came when she insisted on riding out to check the north pasture fence after Scout's agitated barking suggested predators might be threatening the small herd. "It's too risky," Jacob insisted, his face tight with worry. "You're not experienced enough with the rifle." "Then teach me," Rose countered, "because until you can ride again, someone has to protect this ranch. Unless you prefer I fetch Mr. Henderson to do the job you married me to help with." The flash of surprise on Jacob's face might have been amusing under other circumstances. "That's not fair. Neither is expecting me to be capable only when it's convenient for you," Rose replied more gently. "I'm stronger than I look, Jacob, let me prove it." In the end, he relented, giving her a crash course in handling the Winchester repeating rifle before she set off on his gentlest mare. When she returned 3 hours later, having successfully scared off the wolf that had been testing their fence line, the pride in Jacob's eyes warmed her more than any words could have. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink, Jacob reached for her hand. "I underestimated you," he admitted. "I think I've been doing that since the beginning." "Most people do," Rose replied with a small smile. "I'm used to it." "Don't get used to it from me," he said seriously. "I'm learning." Their nights had settled into a new pattern as well. They shared the bed now, though Jacob's injuries prevented more than gentle embraces and increasingly passionate kisses. Rose discovered her husband was a man of surprising tenderness, his work-roughened hands capable of touches so light they made her shiver. Each night they explored this new territory between them a little further, learning each other's responses, building a physical language to match the emotional one developing in daylight hours. Yet for all this progress, Rose sensed Jacob still held part of himself in reserve. There were moments when shadow crossed his face for no apparent reason, when he would withdraw into silence while working on ledgers or staring into the fire. Rose had learned not to press at these times, but she wondered what memories or thoughts haunted him. The answer came unexpectedly, nearly 3 weeks after the accident. Jacob's mobility had improved enough that he could handle light chores, and they had spent the afternoon working together in the vegetable garden. As Rose prepared supper, Jacob sat at the table going through mail that Mr. Henderson had brought from town. She heard his sharp intake of breath before she saw what had caused it, a newspaper with a bold headline about railroad expansion through Montana territory. "Bad news?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Jacob's face had gone expressionless in the way she now recognized meant he was suppressing strong emotion. The Northern Pacific is pushing westward again. They're surveying new routes through this region. Rose waited, sensing there was more to his reaction than mere interest in railroad news. When he remained silent, she gently prompted, "Is that a concern for Crescent Ridge?" Jacob folded the paper carefully, precisely, his movements controlled. "My father was a railroad man before the war, an engineer. He believed in progress, in connecting the country through rail lines." He paused. "He died defending a Union supply train." "I'm sorry," Rose said quietly. "After the war, I wanted nothing to do with railroads or the progress they represented. I came west to find open spaces, to build something with my own hands that had nothing to do with iron and steam and schedules. Understanding dawned, and now you're afraid the railroad might threaten that." Jacob nodded grimly. "Railroads change everything they touch. Towns spring up, land values shift, open range gets divided and fenced. Some call it progress, I call it destruction." Rose sat beside him, covering his clenched fist with her hand. "This land is yours, they can't simply take it." "Can't they?" Jacob's voice held a bitterness she hadn't heard before. "Railroads have money and government connections. They get what they want, one way or another." "Then we'll face it together," Rose said firmly. "If it even becomes a concern at all. The newspaper just mentioned surveys, not definite plans." Jacob looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing something new. "We," he repeated. "You'd stand with me against the railroad." "Of course I would. This is my home now too." The words emerged naturally, but Rose realized as she spoke them how true they had become. In just over a month, Crescent Ridge had indeed become home, not just the physical place, but the life she and Jacob were building together. Something in Jacob's expression softened, the tension easing from his shoulders. He turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together. "I've been fighting so many battles alone for so long," he said quietly. "I'm not used to having an ally." "Well, get used to it," Rose replied, squeezing his hand. "You're stuck with me now." Later that night, as moonlight spilled through the bedroom window, Jacob spoke again of his father, of the complicated relationship they'd had, of his youthful rebellion against everything the older man had valued, of the regret that had followed news of his death at Confederate hands. Rose listened, offering the gift of her attention as Jacob unburdened himself of memories long suppressed. "I came west partly to honor him, partly to escape his shadow," Jacob admitted. "He believed in conquering nature with technology. I wanted to live in harmony with the land instead." "Perhaps you're more alike than different," Rose suggested gently. "You both built things, created. Made your mark on the world." Jacob considered this, his hand absently stroking Rose's hair where her head rested against his good shoulder. "I never thought of it that way. Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to see the truth of ourselves." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You're a wise woman, Rose Lawson. And don't you forget it," she murmured sleepily, nestling closer to his warmth. As Jacob held his wife in the quiet Montana night, he marveled at how quickly she had become essential to him, not just her help with the ranch, but her perspective, her strength, her growing place in his heart. The walls he had built around himself were crumbling daily beneath her gentle persistence. Yet the railroad news had awakened old fears, old wounds. Jacob tightened his arm around Rose's sleeping form, vowing silently to protect what they were building together, no matter what challenges came their way. He had found something precious, something he hadn't even known to seek. Nothing, not railroads, not nature's fury, not his own stubborn pride, would take it from him. The first signs of trouble came in early July, as summer heat baked the Montana grasslands golden. A surveying party appeared on the ridge above Crescent Ridge, their instruments glinting in the sun as they took measurements and made notes. Jacob watched them grimly from the corral where he was breaking a young horse, his shoulder mostly healed but still occasionally troubling him. When Rose brought him water, she followed his gaze to the distant figures. Is that what I think it is? Jacob nodded tersely. Railroad men, getting bolder if they're surveying this close to the ranch house. 3 days later, a well-dressed gentleman arrived at their door. Andrew Phillips introduced himself as a representative of the Northern Pacific Railroad, his polished manners and city clothes standing out starkly against the rustic backdrop of the ranch. Mr. Lawson, he said, removing his hat as Rose invited him inside, I'm here to discuss a matter of significant mutual benefit. Jacob remained standing while Phillips took a seat at their table, accepting the coffee Rose offered with practiced charm. I've reviewed the land surveys, Phillips continued, and I'm authorized to make you a very generous offer for a right-of-way through the eastern portion of your property. Not interested, Jacob said flatly. Phillips's smile didn't falter. Perhaps you should hear the figure before deciding. The railroad is prepared to pay 3 times the current market value for the affected acreage. The land's not for sale, not at any price. Mr. Lawson, Phillips leaned forward, his voice reasonable, persuasive. Progress is inevitable. The railroad will connect Montana to markets east and west. Your cattle could be transported more efficiently. Supplies would become more affordable. You stand to benefit tremendously. All I see is the destruction of open range and the end of a way of life, Jacob countered. Your progress comes at too high a cost. Rose, who had remained silent, studying the railroad man carefully, now spoke. Mr. Phillips, exactly how much of our land would this right-of-way require? Phillips turned to her with evident relief at finding a more receptive audience. Just a corridor, Mrs. Lawson. 600 feet wide along the eastern boundary, hardly noticeable in a property this size. That's our best grazing land, Jacob interjected, and it cuts access to the East Creek. Which the railroad would compensate you handsomely for, Phillips countered smoothly. Enough to purchase additional acreage elsewhere, if desired. Rose met Jacob's gaze across the room, reading the tension in his stance, the principles at stake. Thank you for your offer, Mr. Phillips, she said firmly. But as my husband said, we're not interested in selling any portion of Crescent Ridge. The railroad man's expression hardened slightly, though his voice remained pleasant. I urge you both to reconsider. The Northern Pacific has the support of the territorial government. There are other ways to secure the right-of-way if necessary. Is that a threat? Jacob asked quietly. Philip stood, replacing his hat, merely a statement of fact. I'll return in a week for your final answer. I do hope it will be more forward-thinking. After he departed, Jacob paced the cabin like a caged animal. They'll try to take it by force if we refuse. Eminent domain, they'll call it. Can they do that? Rose asked. They've done it elsewhere. The law favors progress over individual rights. Jacob stopped pacing, his expression grim. But I won't give up without a fight. In the days that followed, Jacob rode to neighboring ranches, discovering that others had received similar visits. Some smaller operations were considering selling, tempted by the railroad's generous offers. Others, like the Hendersons, stood firmly against any incursion. We should form a coalition, Jacob told Rose after returning from one such visit. United, we might have more legal standing. Rose agreed, but privately worried about the toll this fight was taking on her husband. The railroad threat had awakened not just his protective instincts for the land, but old wounds related to his father. At night he often lay awake beside her, his body tense with unspoken concerns. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the tall grass, Rose broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. Jacob, she began carefully, what if we considered the railroad's offer, but on our terms? He stiffened beside her. What do you mean? What if we negotiated for a right-of-way that did less damage? Perhaps further from the creek, with guaranteed cattle crossings. She touched his arm gently. I'm not suggesting we give in, only that we consider all options. Jacob was silent so long that Rose feared she had overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. My father died believing the railroad represented America's future. When I came west, I swore I'd build something different, something that worked with the land instead of conquering it. He looked at her, conflict evident in his eyes. If I compromise now, what was it all for? It was for this, Rose said, gesturing to the ranch around them. For the life you've built, for what we're building together. She took his hand. Fighting doesn't always mean standing immovable. Sometimes it means finding a way to protect what matters most, while accepting that change is inevitable. Jacob's fingers tightened around hers. I don't know if I can bend on this, Rose. Then I'll stand with you, whatever you decide, she promised. I just want you to consider all paths, not just the ones that seem most familiar. The week passed too quickly. Jacob conferred with neighbors, consulted the territorial lawyer in Helena, and spent long hours poring over maps of his property. Rose supported him quietly, managing the daily needs of the ranch while he focused on the larger threat. They were breaking fast on the morning. Phillips was expected to return when Scout's warning bark alerted them to riders approaching, not just Phillips, but 3 other men as well. Stay inside, Jacob told Rose as he buckled on his gun belt. I will not, she replied firmly. We face this together. The determined set of her jaw brooked no argument. Jacob nodded once and they stepped onto the porch together as the riders reached the yard. Phillips dismounted first, his expression confident. Mr. and Mrs. Lawson, good morning. I've brought some colleagues who can answer any technical questions about the proposed right-of-way. There's nothing to discuss, Jacob began, but Rose laid a hand on his arm. Actually, Mr. Phillips, we have a counter-proposal, she said clearly. Jacob glanced at her in surprise, but Rose continued steadily. We remain opposed to selling any portion of Crescent Ridge. However, we would consider leasing a narrower right-of-way along the far northern boundary, provided certain conditions are met regarding cattle crossings, water access, and fair compensation. Phillips raised an eyebrow, studying her with new interest. That's an unexpected development. The northern route would require additional surveying, but it might be feasible. He turned to Jacob. Is this proposal authorized by you as well, Mr. Lawson? Jacob looked at Rose, her steady gaze, her quiet confidence, her subtle nod of encouragement. In that moment he recognized what she was offering, not capitulation, but a third path he hadn't considered, one that might preserve both his principles and their future. My wife speaks for both of us, he said finally. But understand this, we're prepared to fight through legal channels if our terms aren't met. The coalition of ranchers I've formed will challenge any attempt at forced acquisition. Phillips's expression suggested he hadn't expected such organized resistance. I see. Well, perhaps we can discuss your specific conditions. The railroad prefers negotiation to litigation when possible. What followed was hours of tense discussion around the Lawsons' table. Rose revealed herself to be a surprisingly shrewd negotiator, pressing for specific protections and compensation that made Jacob realize she had given this far more thought than he'd known. By afternoon, they had the outline of an agreement that would allow the railroad a more limited presence than originally demanded, while protecting the ranch's most vital resources. As Phillips and his men departed with promises to return with formal documents, Jacob turned to Rose with newfound admiration. When did you become an expert negotiator? She smiled slightly. I watched my father bargain with grain merchants for years, and I had time to study the maps while you were visiting neighbors. Her expression grew serious. Are you angry that I spoke up? Jacob shook his head slowly. No. Surprised but not angry, he took her hands in his. You found a path I couldn't see because I was too busy fighting old battles. Your principles matter, Jacob. I wouldn't have suggested compromise if I didn't believe we could preserve what's most important. He drew her into his arms, holding her close. You're what's most important, he said quietly against her hair. You and this life we're building, I see that now. That night, as moonlight bathed their bedroom in silver light, Jacob and Rose came together completely for the first time as husband and wife. The last barriers between them fell away as they expressed physically what had been growing emotionally for months, not just desire, but deep and abiding connection. Jacob's touch was reverent, discovering Rose's body with wonder and care. Rose's responses were uninhibited, trusting him with her vulnerability as well as her passion. Afterward, as they lay entwined, Jacob traced idle patterns on Rose's bare shoulder. I realized something today, he said quietly. What's that? She murmured, pleasantly drowsy in his arms. I've spent years defining myself in opposition to my father, to the railroad, to progress, always fighting against something, He pressed a kiss to her forehead. You've taught me to fight for something instead, for us. For our future. Rose smiled against his chest. Does that mean you've made peace with the railroad compromise? I'm working on it, he admitted, but I've made peace with something more important, the fact that life means change. Fighting against all change is like trying to hold back the tide. His arms tightened around her. Some changes, though, are worth embracing. Rose lifted her head to look at him, her honey-blonde hair spilling across his chest. Like a mail-order bride disrupting your solitary existence. Jacob smiled, a full, unguarded smile that transformed his face. Exactly like that. Best decision I ever made, even if I was too stubborn to admit it at first. You're still stubborn, Rose teased, pressing a kiss to his lips. But I wouldn't have you any other way. As they drifted toward sleep, Jacob reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From strangers bound by a practical arrangement to partners in every sense, they had found in each other what neither had dared hope for, not just security or companionship, but deep and abiding love. The road ahead would hold challenges, he knew. The railroad negotiation was just the beginning of changes coming to Montana territory. But facing those challenges with Rose beside him no longer seemed daunting, but exciting. The frontier that had once seemed to demand isolation, as the price of survival now offered its greatest gift in the form of connection. Jacob pulled Rose closer, thanking whatever providence had guided her to answer his advertisement. He had sought a practical partner and found instead the missing piece of his heart, proof that even in the untamed West, love could take root and flourish in the most unexpected soil. 3 years later, Jacob stood on the porch of Crescent Ridge's expanded ranch house, watching as a train whistle sounded in the distance. The Northern Pacific Line now cut along the far northern edge of their property, just visible from this vantage point. True to their negotiated agreement, cattle crossings had been built, water access preserved, and fair compensation paid, enough to add 200 acres to their southern boundary and build the larger house Rose had designed. Papa. Train coming, 3-year-old Emma tugged excitedly at his pant leg, her blue eyes, so like his own, wide with enthusiasm. I hear it, little one, Jacob said, lifting his daughter to his shoulders where she could see better. Emma had been fascinated by the iron horses since she was old enough to recognize them, a fact that still amused Rose given Jacob's former antipathy. Speaking of his wife, Jacob turned as the door opened behind him. Rose emerged, their 6-month-old son Thomas cradled against her shoulder. At 23, she was more beautiful than ever, motherhood having added a soft contentment to her features, while taking nothing from the intelligence and determination he'd come to rely on. Is the supply shipment coming today? She asked, leaning against his side as Emma bounced excitedly on his shoulders. Should be. The seed catalogs you wanted, and those books from Philadelphia. Rose smiled, and your new breeding stock from Wyoming. Don't pretend you're not just as excited about those Hereford bulls as I am about my books. Jacob laughed, the sound easy and natural now where it had once been rare. Caught me? He shifted Emma to one arm so he could wrap the other around Rose and Thomas. Crescent Ridge is going to have the finest herd in the territory in 5 years. In the state, you mean? Montana's statehood is practically guaranteed now. State then, Jacob agreed, watching as the train appeared on the horizon, a plume of steam marking its progress. More changes coming. Good ones, I think, Rose said. Thomas will grow up in a state, not a territory, and with the new school being built in town, Emma will have better education than we could have hoped for when we married. Jacob looked down at his family, at Rose, who had transformed from mail-order bride to beloved wife and partner. At Emma, their firstborn, with her mother's honey-blonde hair and his stubborn chin. At baby Thomas, already showing signs of his mother's thoughtful nature. This was a richness he could never have imagined in his solitary days, a wealth no gold mine could match. Any regrets? He asked softly, the question a ritual between them now. Rose smiled up at him, the love in her eyes unmistakable. Not a single one, you. Jacob shook his head, bending to kiss her gently. How could I regret the best decision of my life? Emma giggled at their display of affection, while Thomas made a soft cooing sound against his mother's shoulder. Together, the Lawson family watched the train making its steady progress across the northern horizon, no longer an enemy to be resisted, but simply one part of the changing landscape they called home. The sun shone golden on Crescent Ridge's expanded boundaries, on fields where cattle grazed, On the garden, Rose had quadrupled in size. On the new barn and bunkhouse, where 2 ranch hands now lived to help with the growing operation. From mail-order arrangement to true partnership, from lonely defiance to loving acceptance, Jacob and Rose had built something neither could have created alone: a family, a legacy, a future. As Emma pointed excitedly at the train and Thomas drifted to sleep in Rose's arms, Jacob silently thanked whatever fate, providence, or simple human loneliness had prompted him to place that advertisement 3 years ago. His gritty cowboy days of solitude were long behind him, replaced by something infinitely more precious: a life shared, challenges faced together, and a love that had not just survived the frontier but flourished because of it.